I want you to imagine just for a second that you hold the most powerful, prestigious job in the entire world.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, so you are like the CEO of this massive, sprawling global enterprise. Your word is absolute law.
Sounds pretty good so far.
Yeah, until one day you are fired, just completely ousted. But, and here's the bizarre catch, your board of directors doesn't actually tell you that you've been fired.
Wait, they don't tell the CEO he's out?
Exactly. They let you keep your massive corner office. They let you keep your hundreds of assistants. They still bow to you. They still call you the CEO. And they even promise to pay you this astronomical salary to just, sit there and pretend nothing has changed.
That sounds like a psychological experiment designed to break someone's grip on reality.
Right.
Or maybe the plot of a really unsettling surrealist film.
It really does. But it wasn't a movie, and it definitely wasn't an experiment. This was the absolute baffling daily reality for Puyi, the last emperor of China, right after his abdication.
Yeah, it's just an incredible situation.
It is. So welcome back to part 2 of our massive 9-part deep dive into the life of Puyi. If you were with us for part 1, you know the stage is set. The year is 1912.
Right. The Qing dynasty has officially fallen.
Exactly. After ruling China for nearly 3 centuries, the revolution has swept the nation, and China is now, for the very first time in its history, a republic.
And the transition from an ancient, divinely mandated empire to a modern republic, it's one of the most tectonic shifts in global history.
Absolutely.
We often talk about these events from a macro perspective, right? Like armies moving, treaties being signed, governments collapsing.
Yeah, the big picture stuff.
Exactly. But our focus today requires us to zoom all the way in. We're going right into the epicenter, into the very eye of this political storm, to look at the isolated individuals who are basically left behind by the march of time.
And our mission for this deep dive is to explore the incredibly surreal twilight years of the imperial court inside the walls of the Forbidden City. We're looking at this very specific, very strange window of time from 1912 to 1924.
It's a fascinating era.
It really is. We are going to unpack a chaotic, almost unbelievable 12-day restoration of the empire. And we're going to explore the arrival of a Scottish tutor. A guy who introduced a sheltered, isolated god king to bicycles, Harold Lloyd silent films, and, of all things, prank phone calls.
It is a period that is entirely defined by its contradictions. I mean, you have ancient, unbending rituals happening right alongside the violent intrusion of modern 20th century technology and, global geopolitics.
So let's lay out the terms of this reality. Because on paper, the Qing dynasty is dead. February 12, 1912, it is over. The revolutionary forces have won.
Legally, yes.
But for Puyi, who is still just a small child at this point, the empire is very much alive inside the towering red walls of his home. And this illusion is legally binding.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's all thanks to a document called the Articles of Favorable Treatment of the Great Qing Emperor after his abdication. I want to break down the terms of this deal because it basically functions like the most extreme golden parachute in recorded history.
The stipulations of that document are fascinating, especially when you consider the normal logistics of overthrowing a monarchy.
Right. Usually it doesn't end well for the royals.
Exactly. Historically, when a dynasty falls, the royal family meets a pretty grim fate. They're exiled, imprisoned, or marched to the guillotine. The new regime usually wants to completely eradicate the old symbol of power.
Because they're a threat.
Right. But the new Republic of China took a radically different approach. Under these articles, Puyi was explicitly allowed to retain his imperial title.
Which means the new Republican government is legally required to refer to a private citizen as the emperor.
Yes.
They agreed to treat him with the protocol attached to a foreign monarch. It's like they're saying, "Welcome to Beijing, Your Majesty, the city you personally owned last week. Enjoy your stay."
It's totally bizarre, and the physical reality of the treaty was just as absurd as the legal titles. Puyi wasn't exiled to some quiet country estate.
No, he stayed right in the capital.
Right. The imperial court was permitted to remain in the northern half of the Forbidden City. That's a sprawling complex of palaces known as the private apartments. And they also got to keep the summer palace outside the city.
So they just carved out a mini-state.
Basically, yeah. The Republic essentially created a sovereign enclave, a Vatican City of sorts, right in the absolute heart of the Republican capital.
And they funded it. The Republic granted the imperial household an annual subsidy of 4 million silver taels just to maintain this illusion.
Which is a staggering amount of wealth.
Let's provide some context for that number for the listener. Because a tael isn't a coin, it's a measurement of weight. One tael is roughly 1.3 ounces of pure silver.
Right.
So 4 million taels is over 160 tons of solid silver. Handing over 160 tons of silver every single year to the guy you just deposed is a massive financial burden for a brand new, fragile government.
It really was. It represented a huge percentage of the state's potential budget. Unsurprisingly, it was a promise the Republic couldn't entirely keep.
I mean, how could they?
Exactly. The full amount of silver was never actually delivered, and the subsidy was severely reduced and eventually abolished after just a few years. But the initial intent, the intent enshrined on paper, was to maintain the extravagant, deeply wasteful lifestyle of the court exactly as it had been for centuries.
So the thousands of eunuchs, the elaborate daily banquets, the silk wardrobes.
It was all meant to continue uninterrupted.
But the most astonishing fact in all of this isn't the 160 tons of silver or the prime real estate. It's the absolute information blackout. Puyi was not informed in February 1912 that his reign had ended.
No, he was completely shielded from it.
The child emperor was entirely in the dark. He continued to believe he was the ruling monarch of all of China for a significant period after the ink had dried on the Republic's founding documents.
Because the adults in the room, the Empress Dowager, the high officials, the tutors, they made a collective decision to maintain the facade.
Why, though?
Well, they shielded him from the news, partly to protect him, but mostly to protect their own positions. For a child whose entire existence was bounded by high walls and deferential servants, there was simply no way for him to independently verify the political reality of the outside world.
You have an entire court, thousands of eunuchs, brilliant academic tutors, military advisors, and nobody tells the boss he's out of a job.
Nobody says a word.
He doesn't actually realize changes are happening until over a year later in 1913.
Right, the bubble finally began to leak when Empress Dowager Long Yu died in 1913.
Okay, so what happens then?
The president of the new republic, a powerful former king general named Yuan Shikai, arrived at the Forbidden City to pay his respects to the deceased empress. And the protocol of this visit forced the issue.
Because he's not going to bow.
Exactly. President Yuan was not going to kneel to Puyi as a subject. It was at this point that Puyi's tutors finally had to sit the young boy down and explain the shifting dynamics. They had to explain that this visit from the president meant the world had fundamentally changed.
The whole arrangement feels like a severance package designed entirely for optics. But if you're looking at this from the outside, you have to ask the glaring question. Why?
The big question, yeah.
Why would a newly born republic spend so much time, effort, and treasure maintaining a fake, miniature empire in the middle of their capital? If you just fought a revolution to get rid of the monarchy, why leave the ultimate symbol of the old regime sitting right there playing dress-up in the throne room?
The answer reveals the deep, self-serving cynicism of the politics at play in 1912. This favorable treatment wasn't born out of the goodness of the revolutionaries' hearts, nor was it simple respect for ancient tradition.
So it was a setup.
Totally.
Right.
The man who negotiated this deal, President Yuan Shikai, had profound ulterior motives. Yuan wasn't a committed Republican. He was an opportunist who was actively planning to eventually restore the monarchy.
Wait, the first president of the republic secretly wanted to bring the emperor back.
Well, he wanted to bring an emperor back, but not Puyi. Yuan wanted to restore the monarchy with himself sitting on the throne as the founder and divine ruler of a brand new dynasty.
Oh, wow. So he's looking at the Forbidden City not as a protected historical museum, but as his future house.
Exactly. He was using Puyi as a high-status custodian. By keeping the imperial court functioning, keeping the rituals alive, and keeping the staff of eunuchs and cooks in place, Yuan was effectively keeping the seat warm.
Yeah, it's so cynical.
It really is.
Yeah.
He was preserving the infrastructure of imperial power so that when the time was right, he could simply evict the boy and take over a fully operational palace.
That is deeply Machiavellian. He's weaponizing the boy he just deposed to maintain the plumbing of the empire so he can slide into the driver's seat later.
Exactly.
And Yuan didn't exactly hide these ambitions well. The psychological tactics he used against this kid are incredibly creepy.
They were. Puyi started to catch on to Yuan's plans precisely because of how Yuan behaved. The president began adopting a decidedly imperial take on his office, deliberately blurring the lines between a democratic leader and an autocratic monarch.
Like, what did he do?
For instance, Yuan started bringing in military brass bands to serenade him whenever he sat down for a meal, which is a tradition heavily associated with royal courts.
Just imagine the geography of this for Puyi. You are a young boy trapped in the northern half of your own palace. You are looking out the window, and across the street is the presidential palace.
Right there in plain sight.
The historical sources say Puyi spent hours just staring at those gates. He would literally curse Yuan Shikai out loud whenever he saw the president coming and going in his motorcar.
The boy loathed him. Puyi explicitly referred to Yuan as a traitor. You have to remember the psychological development happening here. Puyi is growing up, he is still a child, but he is rapidly absorbing the reality of his own powerlessness.
Yeah, that's got to be infuriating.
He watches the man who betrayed his family's dynasty parading around in modern vehicles, openly preparing to steal the ultimate prize.
And what does a powerless kid do when he hates the guy across the street? He tries to sabotage him in the only way he knows how. I love this specific anecdote because it perfectly illustrates the tragic gap between Puyi's perception of power and actual real-world power.
It really does.
Puyi decides he's going to stop Yuan from becoming emperor, and his master plan is to hide the imperial seals.
It is a poignant, almost heartbreaking moment of childlike logic. In Chinese dynastic history, the physical carved jade seals are not just stamps. They are the mandate of heaven made manifest.
They're magical, basically.
To him, yes, they are the ultimate mystical symbols of legitimacy. Puyi thinks, entirely logically for a child raised in this ancient system, if he doesn't possess the physical seals, he simply cannot become the emperor. So he takes them and hides them away in his private rooms.
It's the equivalent of a kid hiding the car keys so his parents can't drive away. He thinks he has solved the entire geopolitical crisis. And then his elderly, highly educated tutors have to gently break the news to him. What was that conversation like?
Well, they had to introduce him to the harsh, unromantic reality of modern political power. They explained that if Yuan Shikai had the military backing and the political will to become emperor, hiding a piece of ancient jade wouldn't stop him.
Because he could just make new ones.
Exactly. Yuan would simply hire a craftsman and have new seals carved. It was a crushing realization for Puyi. It was the moment he learned that his ancient sacred symbols held absolutely no magical power over the man who controlled the actual army and the state treasury.
A brutal reality check. And Yuan actually did try to pull it off. In late 1915, he formally proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty. He even floated the idea of marrying his own daughter to Puyi to somehow legitimize the transition, attempting to bind the fading Qing dynasty to his new one.
But Yuan severely miscalculated the mood of the nation. He overplayed his hand.
The people weren't having it.
Not at all. He faced immediate, massive popular opposition across the country. The Chinese public might have been uncertain about how a republic should function, but they were absolutely certain they did not want Yuan Shikai as a new emperor.
So what happened?
The military governors rebelled, the southern provinces threatened to secede, and the backlash was so severe that Yuan was forced to humiliatingly abdicate his brand new throne just a few months later. He died in disgrace shortly after, his grand ambitions completely in ruins.
So Yuan's imperial ambitions completely implode. But here is the critical takeaway for our deep dive. Just because Yuan failed, it didn't mean the desire for an emperor died with his career.
No, not at all.
That lingering royalist sentiment, that nagging feeling among certain groups that maybe a messy, chaotic republic wasn't the right fit for China, didn't just vanish. And that underlying tension sets the stage for one of the most explosive, highly improbable political comebacks in history.
Which brings us out of the immediate post-revolutionary period and into the volatile summer of 1917.
Right. We need to understand the geopolitical backdrop to grasp how a deposed child emperor suddenly gets put back in charge of the country. Because by 1917, the 1912 revolution is 5 years in the rearview mirror.
Yes.
The republic is established. But restorationism, the active political movement to bring the Qing dynasty back, was actually quite popular among certain groups who was looking at the republic and saying, let's go back to the emperor.
The restorationist movement was not a monolith. It was a coalition of very distinct, powerful factions who felt actively disenfranchised by the new republican system.
Okay, who are we talking about?
First, you have the ethnic minorities, specifically the Manchus and Mongols. The Qing dynasty was a Manchu dynasty. Under the new Han-dominated republican government, these groups felt they were being targeted and discriminated against. For them, restoring the king wasn't just about politics, it was about ethnic survival and reclaiming their lost status.
That makes perfect sense. They went from being the absolute ruling class of the empire to feeling marginalized and threatened in the new republic. Who else is pushing for this?
You also had segments of the Han Chinese population, particularly in northeastern China, who maintained deep cultural and traditional ties to the king. But looking more broadly, there was a pervasive sense of disappointment sweeping the nation.
Disappointment in the republic.
Yeah. Many people looked at the Republican government in Beijing and saw nothing but corruption, infighting, and dysfunction. The Republic wasn't solving China's massive internal poverty, nor was it projecting strength on the international stage.
It's that classic human nostalgia for stability.
Yeah.
The feeling of, sure, the old empire had its flaws, it was autocratic, but at least we knew the rules and the trains ran on time, so to speak.
Exactly. Add to that the deeply entrenched political operators.
Yeah.
You had numerous reactionaries and disempowered ex-king officials who had lost their immense wealth and societal status during the revolution. They were actively conspiring to overthrow the Republic to get their jobs back.
So they're waiting for their moment.
Right. So while pro-king groups like the Royalist Party were technically underrepresented in the official Republican parliament, they remained a very powerful, heavily armed, simmering factor in Chinese politics throughout the 1910s. There had already been several Royalist uprisings in the provinces, though they had all been crushed.
Until the spring of 1917, the powder keg is fully loaded. What is the spark that finally ignites it?
The trigger was, surprisingly, the First World War.
Wait, how does a trench war in Europe cause a coup in Beijing?
It comes down to a massive, paralyzing political crisis between the two most powerful men in the Chinese Republic. The president, Li Yonhong, and his premier, a powerful military man named Duan Qirui.
Okay, what are they fighting about?
The bitter debate was over whether China should formally abandon its neutrality, join the Allied powers, and declare war on Germany.
Let's track the dominoes falling here, because a foreign policy debate leading to the return of a child emperor requires some specific mechanics. Why did joining the war matter so much?
The faction that wanted to join the war believed that by fighting alongside the Allies, Britain, France, and eventually, the U.S.-China would earn a seat at the post-war negotiating table.
They wanted leverage.
Right. They specifically wanted to force the return of the Shandong province, which Germany held as a colonial concession, and which Japan was currently trying to seize. Premier Duan Qirui saw joining the war as a strategic necessity for China's future sovereignty.
And the president disagreed.
Yes. President Li Yonhong was deeply resistant, fearing it would just drag China into further debt and chaos. This confrontation completely fractured the government.
The situation escalates to the point where President Li actually fires Premier Duan from his post. And Duan isn't just a politician, he's a commander in the Beiyang army. For our listeners who might not be familiar, what is the Beiyang army, and why does firing Duan cause the whole system to break?
The Beiyang army was essentially the modern Western-trained military apparatus of northern China. It had been created during the late Qing dynasty, but was characterized by deep personal loyalty to its commanders rather than loyalty to the state or the constitution.
Ah, so it's a personality cult.
Basically. When President Li dismissed Premier Duan, the military governors who commanded these Beiyang forces were furious. They were fiercely loyal to Duan. They immediately abandoned Beijing, gathered their forces in the neighboring city of Tianjin, and openly called for a military rebellion against the president to seize the capital.
The republic is literally splitting apart at the seams. You have President Li sitting in his office in Beijing, and he's got heavily armed rebel military governors massing troops in Tianjin, explicitly threatening to march on the capital. What is his countermove?
In a move of sheer, unadulterated desperation, on June 7, 1917, President Li sends a request to a powerful general named Zhang Sun, asking him to march his army to Beijing to mediate the situation between the president and the rebel governors.
He invites General Zhang Sun. This is crucial, because Zhang Sun is widely known as a fierce, unrepentant royalist.
Yes, very much so.
His soldiers famously refused to cut off their traditional king cues. Inviting Zhang to mediate a crisis threatening the republic is like trying to put out a grease fire in your kitchen by throwing a bucket of gasoline on it. He doesn't want to fix the republic. He wants to burn it down and build a throne on the ashes.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation by President Li. General Zhang accepts the invitation to march on the capital, but before he even arrives, he demands that the Republican Parliament be entirely dissolved.
Which is illegal, right?
Entirely. This was a demand that President Li considered completely unconstitutional, but he was trapped.
And then The twist. We hit the early morning hours of July Ren 1917. Walk us through exactly what happens when the sun comes up.
At 4 a.m. on July 1st, General Zhang Sun, taking full advantage of the utter political chaos and the power vacuum, enters Beijing with a small, heavily armed entourage of his queue-wearing troops.
Just marches right in.
He bypasses the presidential offices entirely. He goes straight to the towering gates of the Forbidden City, enters the imperial compound, and formally proclaims the restoration of Puyi as the Emperor of China.
Wow.
The Qing monarchy, dead and buried since February 1912, is suddenly, violently revived before the city even wakes up.
At 4 in the morning, and the craziest part of this mechanic is the reaction of the Capitol Police Force. You would think the Republican police would fight back against a royalist general storming the Capitol, but they just submit to the new government. They roll over instantly. Why? Are they secretly royalists or just terrified of Zhang's army?
It's a mix of both. The police and local garrisons were deeply demoralized by the endless political infighting of the Republic. Many favored a return to the perceived order of the king. Furthermore, Zhang didn't just rely on brute force, he used deception.
What kind of deception?
To make the coup look legitimate to the public and the police, another conspirator, General Zhu, actually published a formal edict of restoration that falsified the approval of the president himself.
They forged President Li's signature on a document saying, "I agree, the Republic has failed. Bring back the emperor."
Exactly. It was a remarkably swift, brazen, and well-executed coup, and it quickly became apparent that Zhang wasn't acting alone.
Who else was in on it?
Over the next 48 hours, several high-ranking Republican officials suddenly stripped off their Republican allegiances and revealed their deep royalist sympathies. You had former ministers of war, top diplomats, and police chiefs all suddenly putting on traditional king robes and rushing to the Forbidden City to bow to the teenage emperor.
Just like that.
Just like that. The newly restored court just started pumping out imperial edicts left and right, trying to legally cement this sudden change in reality.
The general public must have been suffering from absolute societal whiplash. You go to sleep in a struggling republic, you wake up on a Tuesday, and suddenly the calendar has rolled back 5 years, the emperor is issuing decrees, and officials are wearing imperial robes again. But what about President Li, the guy who accidentally started all of this by inviting General Zhang into the city? What happens to him?
President Li realizes instantly that he has lost total control of the capital and his own life is in danger. On July 3, he flees the presidential palace in secret with just 2 aides.
Where does he go?
He abandons his post and takes refuge in the Foreign Embassy District, which operated under international law and was immune to Zhang's troops. First, he hides in the French legation, and later he moves to the Japanese embassy.
But before he runs for his life, he does something mechanically vital to the survival of the Republic. He doesn't just vanish. He leaves his official presidential seal behind in the palace. He appoints his vice president as the acting president. And, this is the incredible part, he legally restores Duan Qi as premier.
The very man he had just fired.
Right.
The dismissal that sparked this entire crisis in the first place, essentially hits the undo button on his own massive political blunder, restoring Duan in a desperate attempt to legally empower him to use his massive military forces to defend the Republic against the royalists.
I want to dig into the mechanics of this counterattack, because I am amazed at how fast this unraveled. How did Duan Qi manage to flip the script so quickly? He goes from being the ousted, disgraced premier sulking in Tianjin to suddenly being the commanding savior of the Republic.
Well, Duan was a ruthless pragmatist and a brilliant military tactician. He didn't care about President Li shifting loyalties or the legal niceties of his reappointment. He cared about raw power.
And he didn't want the emperor back.
No, he vehemently opposed the restoration of the monarchy because it threatened his control over the military. As soon as he received the word that he was officially premier again, he instantly took command of the Republican troops stationed near him in Tianjin. He didn't hesitate or wait for further orders.
He just moved.
By July 5, just 4 days after Puyi was put back on the throne, Duan's troops executed a rapid, aggressive maneuver to seize the Beijing-Tianjin railway.
Let's pause and look at the map for a second. Why the railway? Why is that the immediate priority?
In 1917, China, controlling the railway meant controlling everything. It was the only way to move heavy artillery, cavalry, and thousands of troops quickly.
Oh.
It also meant controlling the telegraph lines that ran alongside the tracks and controlling the vital flow of coal into the capital. By seizing the railway, Duan effectively severed Beijing from the rest of the country.
So they're cut off.
Completely. General Zhang Xun and his royalist forces were suddenly trapped in a walled city with no hope of resupply or reinforcements. Duan moved his troops to within 40 kilometers of the capital in a matter of hours.
He moves incredibly fast. And General Zhang, the royalist who started this whole mess, realizes he's in a desperate situation. He leaves the capital with his troops to meet Duan's Republican forces in the field. Zhang's got his loyal soldiers. He even gets some Manchu reinforcements who rally to the emperor's banner. But it's not a fair fight, is it?
Not even close. Zhang was facing overwhelming industrialized military odds. Almost the entire Northern Army, the vast majority of the modern military apparatus, opposed his royalist coup.
So they just steamrolled him.
Pretty much. When Duan's Republican troops solidified their control of the two main railway lines leading to the capital, Zhang's forces were outflanked, outgunned, and forced into a chaotic withdrawal back into the city limits of Beijing.
Which brings us to what is, for me, the absolute climax of this story. It is the most visually striking, surreal, and terrifying moment of this entire era. Because Premier Duan Qirui doesn't just attack with ground troops and artillery, he decides to send a completely unprecedented message to the child emperor and his court. He orders an aerial bombardment of the Forbidden City.
This is a monumental moment in military history that is rarely discussed. It is the very first recorded instance of aerial bombardment deployed by the early Republican-era Chinese Air Force.
I want to frame this image for you, the listener, because the contrast is almost impossible to comprehend. You have the Forbidden City. It is this ancient, deeply isolated imperial court. It is steeped in centuries of unchanging tradition. You have eunuchs sweeping the courtyards, golden yellow-tiled roofs shining in the sun, a teenage emperor sitting on a dragon throne surrounded by incense and ritual.
A scene straight out of antiquity.
Exactly. And suddenly, a low, mechanical roar echoes over the walls. A modern biplane, dripping oil and smelling of exhaust, flies low over this ancient architecture and literally starts dropping bombs. It is the ultimate violent collision of the ancient and modern worlds. Walk us through the mechanics of this air raid. What exactly happened?
The aircraft utilized was a Caudron Type D, which was a rudimentary French-designed biplane made of canvas, wood, and wire.
Barely an airplane by modern standards.
Right. The historical sources name the pilot as Pan Shizong, accompanied by a bombardier named Du Yuan. They took off from the Nanyuan Air Base just outside the city. It's important to note some alternative historical accounts suggest the plane was piloted by Qin Guoyang, who is the principal of the Nanyuan Aviation School.
Okay, so whoever's flying it.
Regardless of who was at the stick, this fragile aircraft flew directly over the massive imperial compound. The bombardier manually tossed 3 small bombs over the side of the open cockpit, aiming for the palaces below.
Wait, they manually tossed them, like just threw them over the side?
Yes, literally by hand.
That is insane. What was the physical damage? Did they destroy the palace? Did they hit the throne room?
The physical damage was actually quite minor. The bombs were very small, rudimentary explosives. However, the raid was deadly. One of the bombs struck a courtyard, and the shrapnel killed a eunuch who was caught in the open.
Oh, wow.
But destroying the physical architecture wasn't the point of the mission. The psychological impact was immense, and it was entirely intentional.
It's pure psychological warfare.
Exactly. The message delivered from that cockpit was unmistakable. The massive, impregnable walls of the Forbidden City, which had protected emperors from peasant rebellions and invading armies for centuries, could no longer protect them from the reality of the 20th century.
You're vulnerable.
The sky itself was no longer safe. The emperor was no longer untouchable.
That has to completely shatter whatever fragile illusion Puyi and his court still held on to. You can't pretend you are the divine ruler of the world when your own roof is being bombed by your own people from a flying machine you can barely comprehend.
It was devastating.
And this bombardment basically signals the immediate end of the 12-day empire. How fast does the royalist resistance collapse after the bombs fall?
Incredibly fast. The morale evaporated instantly. By the 9th day of the restoration, General Zhang, realizing his military position was utterly hopeless with his troops surrounded and the sky raining explosives, resigned from all of his newly appointed government positions. He retained command only of his immediate loyalist troops.
And what is the reaction of the imperial court inside the palace while this is happening?
Absolute panic. The restored court actually hastily drafted an edict of abdication for Puyi again.
His second abdication.
He was going to abdicate for the second time in his short life. But the court officials were so terrified of General Zhang's remaining royalist forces, who were heavily armed and furious, that they didn't dare proclaim the abdication publicly.
They were trapped between two armies.
Yes. Instead, the court began frantic, secret negotiations with the Republican forces surrounding the city. They wanted to prevent a full-scale ground assault and a massacre inside the Forbidden City. They even begged the foreign legations, the diplomats in Beijing, to step in and mediate a ceasefire.
But the negotiations stall because nobody knows who's actually in charge of the city anymore, the terrified court or General Zhang's desperate soldiers.
Right. The uncertainty over who could actually enforce a surrender caused the diplomatic talks to collapse. Consequently, the Republican generals ran out of patience and announced a general all-out assault on the monarchist positions for the morning of July 12.
And the royalists are entrenched on the wall of the Temple of Heaven, of all places. It's another incredibly symbolic, ancient religious site turned into a gritty, modern battlefield. The Republican forces attack the next day, July 13. What is the final outcome?
The battle is brief and decisive. The fighting barely gets started before negotiations suddenly resume. The royalist troops at the Temple of Heaven realize they are completely outgunned by Duan's modern artillery and quickly abandon their positions.
And what about General Zhang?
General Zhang's son, completely dismayed by the rapid collapse of his forces and the failure of his grand vision, abandons his men and flees to the foreign legation's quarter to seek political asylum.
He just runs.
Once Zhang is gone, his remaining troops immediately call for a ceasefire, which the Republicans grant. The 12-day empire is officially over.
Just like that. The shortest, most chaotic comeback tour in history.
Ah.
But we have to look at the macro-political fallout here. Puyi is shoved back into his gilded cage, told to pretend the last 2 weeks never happened. But the republic outside his walls has fundamentally, permanently changed, hasn't it?
It has. The military failure of the royalist coup left the king court and the entire imperial family in an incredibly precarious position. The Republican government, which had previously tolerated them as harmless, expensive relics, was now deeply, actively suspicious of them.
They were a liability now.
They had proven they were a massive political liability, a dangerous focal point for treason and rebellion. The leniency of the 1912 favorable treatment was now viewed as a massive mistake.
And what happens to the Republican leadership? President Li is hiding in a foreign embassy, and Premier Duan is standing in the capital with a massive, victorious army.
President Li, humiliated and realizing his authority was completely destroyed, simply refused to return to his post as president. He formally resigned, leaving the presidency in the hands of the acting president, Feng Gusang.
Giving Duan a clear path.
Exactly. Li's permanent withdrawal created a massive power vacuum at the very top of the civilian government, which allowed Premier Duan Qure to consolidate near total control of the state apparatus. And Duan used that power to get exactly what he wanted from the very beginning of the crisis.
Which was the war.
Yes. On August 14th, 1917, exactly a month after the capital was recaptured from the Royalists, China formally declared war on Germany.
So Duan gets his war, he gets his military alliance, but he essentially breaks the country's fragile democratic institutions to get it.
That is the tragic irony of the situation. Li's exit and Duan's power grab dramatically strengthened the various independent military cliques in northern China. The central government in Beijing became a puppet of a military coalition known as the Anhui clique, which Duan essentially dominated.
Wait, can you explain what a clique is in this context?
Think of them like heavily armed regional political mafias. They controlled territory, collected their own taxes, and commanded their own armies, paying only lip service to the central government.
This is the overture to the warlord era.
It is the starting gun. China fractures even further. Local military governors start ruling their provinces like independent, absolute kingdoms. And in the south, this chaos and blatant military dictatorship in Beijing dramatically increases the popularity and strength of Sun Yat-sen's rival revolutionary government in Guangzhou.
So the restoration backfired completely.
Completely. The 12-day restoration didn't just fail to bring back the king. Its failure accelerated the fracturing of the entire Chinese nation into decades of brutal civil war.
The brief restoration proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Puyi was politically radioactive. He was a danger to the Republic just by drawing breath in the capital, but while the physical walls of the Forbidden City kept him trapped inside, isolated from the warlord chaos tearing the country apart, a new arrival was about to cross the threshold and completely tear down the mental walls that had isolated him his entire life.
This brings us to one of the most fascinating, culturally complex relationships in modern history.
Let's introduce this figure. It is March 3rd, 1919. The world is recovering from the Great War, and a Scottish scholar and British diplomat named Reginald Johnston arrives at the gates of the Forbidden City.
Yes, Johnston.
I want to understand the logic here. Why is a Scotsman, a foreigner, walking into the most exclusive, traditional, xenophobic Chinese court in the world to serve as a tutor for the former emperor?
The hiring of Johnston traces back directly to the new president of the Republic at the time, Xu Shicheng. Xu was a deeply interesting historical figure because, despite being the sworn head of the Republic, he privately, genuinely believed that the monarchy would eventually, inevitably be restored.
Wait, even after the utter disaster of the 12-day coup, the president of the Republic still looks at this teenager and thinks, he's the future.
He believed it was a highly probable future. And because Xu believed a restoration was inevitable, he felt it was a matter of vital national security to prepare Puyi for the complexities of the modern world.
He wanted him educated.
He didn't want an emperor whose entire worldview was shaped solely by ancient Confucian texts and subservient eunuchs. He wanted Puyi to understand global geopolitics, modern statecraft, and international diplomacy.
So he hires Johnston.
So he hires Reginald Johnston, an Oxford-educated scholar, specifically to teach the teenage ex-emperor subjects like political science, European constitutional history, and the English language.
But the imperial court, the traditionalists and the eunuchs, weren't just going to hand over the mind of their god king to a foreigner without establishing some ground rules. There was a massive, immediate clash over the curriculum.
The traditionalists in the court were terrified. They viewed Western influence as a corrupting poison that would destroy the emperor's divine nature. So they attempted to impose incredibly strict, almost comical rules on what Johnston was allowed to teach. He was officially permitted to give Puyi only 5 specific texts in English to read.
If I had to guess what an ancient imperial court would approve for English study, I'd assume a dictionary, maybe an encyclopedia, something dry and factual. What were the 5 books?
They approved English translations of the 4 great books of Confucianism.
Of course.
That is, the Analects, the Mencius, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean. They wanted him learning Western words, but strictly Chinese concepts.
And the 5th book?
The 5th book was Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland and hardcore Confucian philosophy. That has to be the most surreal syllabus in educational history.
It really is an incredible combination.
Though if you think about it, Alice in Wonderland is a story about a protagonist trapped in a bizarre, nonsensical world governed by strange rules, arbitrary authority figures, and people obsessed with protocol.
That's a very good point.
Honestly, maybe that was the most perfect, realistic preparation for life inside the Forbidden City he could have possibly received.
It is a striking parallel. But Johnston, true to his own strong personality, completely disregarded the court's restrictions. Once he was alone with Puyi, he threw the syllabus out the window.
He just ignored it.
Entirely. He took it upon himself to teach Puyi about broader world history, putting a very special, deliberate focus on the history of the British Empire. He taught him Western philosophy, geography, and mathematics. And critically, Johnston actively taught Puyi about what he perceived as the inherent superiority of constitutional monarchies over chaotic republics.
I want to pause here and look closely at the impact of this. We often view Johnston historically as the heroic figure who opened the windows and let fresh air into Puyi's suffocating, abusive life.
He is often framed that way, yes.
But we have to ask about the consequences of his teachings. By teaching a deposed, deeply impressionable teenager that monarchies are inherently superior in a country that is currently a republic, Johnston is filling Puyi's head with ideas that will later fuel his disastrous, treasonous attempts to regain actual power.
That is a very serious criticism of Johnston's time there.
He is molding Puyi in the image of a British constitutional monarch, completely ignoring the complex, violent realities of Chinese Republican politics. He is arguably shaping a political weapon.
It is a debate that historians continue to have. Johnston genuinely cared for Puyi's well-being. That is undeniable in his writings. He provided a vital lifeline to reality for a boy who was drowning in illusion. But your point about the consequences is crucial.
Because it wasn't just harmless history.
Right. Johnston gave Puyi a deeply romanticized view of Western monarchies. He gave him the intellectual justification to believe that he wasn't just a relic, but that he was actually the solution to China's problems. That ideological seed, planted by a trusted mentor in 1919, absolutely played a role in Puyi's later catastrophic decision to ally with the Japanese to become the puppet emperor of Manchukuo.
And Puyi's immediate reaction to Johnston is fascinating. It wasn't instant friendship. At first, the teenage emperor is absolutely terrified of the Scotsman.
He was very intimidated.
Puyi wrote later in his autobiography about how Johnston's piercing blue eyes made him feel deeply uneasy. He found the foreigner physically and intellectually intimidating.
Yes, very much so.
Puyi actually wrote that he studied his English lessons like a good boy, not daring to talk about other things when I got bored, which is hilarious because that is exactly what he did with his Chinese tutors. If he got bored with his Chinese lessons, he would just walk out or make the tutor stand in the corner. He walked all over his own people, but Johnston commanded instant respect.
Why? Because Johnston existed entirely outside the established ancient hierarchy of the court. Every other adult in Puyi's life was required to kowtow to him, to treat his every whim as a divine command.
Johnston didn't bow.
Johnston didn't view Puyi as a god. He viewed him as a student. He demanded discipline. And as the only person capable of controlling Puyi's erratic behavior, Johnston quickly amassed influence far beyond his official title of English tutor.
So others noticed this.
Oh, absolutely. Even the high-ranking eunuchs who were terrified of the emperor's capricious, sometimes cruel moods, actually began to secretly rely on Johnston to steer Puyi, to calm him down, and to moderate his behavior.
The cultural transformation that follows is staggering. The initial fear turns into deep, profound admiration. Puyi eventually states on the record that Johnston became the major part of my soul. He wrote that Johnston made him feel that Westerners were the most intelligent, advanced, and civilized people in the world.
The linguistic quirks that developed really highlight how deep this influence ran. Culturally, Puyi was drifting incredibly far from his own roots. Remember, he was the emperor of the Qing, which was a Manchu dynasty. His ancestors conquered China from the north.
Right, so you would assume he's fluent in the language of his own dynasty.
You would assume so. But Puyi openly admitted later in life that he only knew a single word in the Manchu language, yili, which simply means arise, a command he used during rituals.
Oh, one word.
Despite studying it for years with dedicated tutors, he openly said it was his worst subject and he had zero interest in it. He preferred speaking Mandarin. But under Johnston's intense influence, he started speaking a form of Chinglish, a rapid hybrid of Mandarin and English phrasing, which quickly became his preferred daily mode of speech.
He even adopted a Western name, didn't he? It wasn't just language, it was identity.
He did. Inspired by British royalty, he insisted that his close staff and eunuchs start addressing him as Henry. And later, when he married, he bestowed the name Elizabeth upon his wife, Empress Wanrong.
So he's Henry, she's Elizabeth.
He is essentially within the walls of an ancient Chinese palace, role-playing as a member of the British royal family.
I want to spend a few minutes looking at the very specific, physical, and highly relatable ways Puyi embraced this modernity, much to the absolute horror of his traditional court. Because some of these anecdotes illustrate the culture clash better than any textbook. Let's start with the battle over the glasses.
This is a perfect example. Johnston, spending hours reading with Puyi, noticed that the teenager was extremely nearsighted. He had developed severe, untreated myopia. Johnston argued, practically, that the emperor needed a pair of modern eyeglasses to see the chalkboard and read his texts properly.
And this seemingly simple medical request causes a massive scandal in the court.
It caused an uproar. Puyi's biological father, Prince Chun, vehemently objected to the idea. In traditional Confucian thought, altering or marring the physical body you were given by your parents is frowned upon, but for an emperor, it was even stricter. Prince Chun argued that it was fundamentally undignified and aesthetically offensive for the divine ruler of China to wear foreign Western spectacles on his face. It broke the illusion of divine physical perfection.
Over a pair of glasses.
But Johnston fought back hard. He threatened to resign. He argued the medical necessity, and after much bitter argument, Johnston prevailed. Puyi got his glasses.
Think about the sheer weight of that. It is such a basic, fundamental human need, the simple ability to see the world clearly. And it was being held hostage by imperial protocol and aesthetic tradition. And once he could physically see clearly, he started changing everything else.
He cut off his queue, right?
Yes. Cutting the queue, the long braid of hair that was the mandated, highly symbolic hairstyle of the Qing dynasty, was a massive, irreversible break with the past. It was a visual declaration that the old ways were dead. He grew a full Western-style head of hair. And he didn't stop there. He discovered the bicycle.
This is my favorite image. The Emperor of China on a bicycle. He became obsessed with riding a bicycle around the ancient stone-paved courtyards of the palace, wildly navigating around horrified eunuchs. But the Forbidden City wasn't built for wheels. Every doorway had a high wooden threshold designed to keep out evil spirits and require people to step carefully.
Right, they're like tripping hazards.
So what did Puyi do? He ordered the eunuchs to literally saw the ancient wooden thresholds out of the doorway so he could ride his bike through the palaces without having to dismount. He was destroying ancient architecture for the sake of modern convenience.
He also becomes a massive cinephile. Johnston introduces him to the concept of cinema, and Puyi is so delighted by the moving pictures, specifically the silent slapstick comedies of Harold Lloyd, that he orders a massive, heavy film projector to be purchased and installed right inside the Forbidden City.
Which again, the court hated.
The older eunuchs fiercely opposed it, viewing it as dark magic, but Puyi didn't care. He was sitting in the halls of his ancestors, eating snacks and laughing at slapstick comedy.
And it wasn't just frivolous entertainment. Johnston, who spoke fluent Mandarin and closely followed the intellectual scene in Republican China, actively introduced Puyi to new-style Chinese books, political magazines, and modern poetry.
So he was reading current events.
This contemporary literature inspired Puyi so much that he actually wrote several poems of his own that were published anonymously in modern New China publications. In 1922, Johnston even brought his personal friend, the famous intellectual, philosopher, and writer Hu Xi, into the Forbidden City to teach Puyi about recent radical developments in modern Chinese literature.
But of all the technology, my absolute favorite detail of Puyi's modernization is his obsession with the telephone. Johnston pulls some strings and gets a modern telephone line installed directly into the private apartments, and Puyi becomes completely addicted to it.
He loved the phone.
The historical sources say he would spend hours making random prank calls to people in Beijing. He would call famous opera singers, he would call restaurants and order massive feasts to fake addresses, he would call Republican officials, all just to hear their voices on the other end of the line.
It sounds funny, and on the surface it is just teenager behavior, but if we analyze the underlying psychology, it is incredibly poignant.
Yeah, it's actually pretty sad.
This is a young man who has been locked behind a massive physical wall his entire life. He has been completely isolated from normal, unscripted human interaction. Every conversation he ever had was dictated by ritual.
So the phone was an escape.
The telephone was a magical copper wire that bypassed the walls and the eunuchs. It connected him directly to the outside world. He was reaching out into the dark, dialing random numbers just to prove to himself that other people actually existed, and that he could interact with them without a script, without ritual, and without someone bowing to him first.
It is just a lonely, profoundly isolated kid making prank calls from a crumbling palace. But the outside world wasn't just waiting around for his phone calls. It was rapidly, violently changing, and Puyi finally started to notice. This brings us to a profound political and intellectual awakening in May of 1919. We need to talk about the May 4th movement. Can you explain what this event was mechanically and why it shattered Puyi's worldview?
The May 4th movement was a massive, unprecedented socio-political explosion in China. It marks the true birth of modern Chinese nationalism. Thousands of Chinese university students, intellectuals, and eventually workers took to the streets of Beijing to fiercely protest. They were furious about the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference following the end of World War I.
Let's connect the dots here.
Yeah.
Why were students in Beijing rioting over a treaty signed in Paris? What was the betrayal?
It goes back to the decision to join the war, which we discussed earlier. China had contributed massively to the Allied war effort, primarily by sending hundreds of thousands of men in the Chinese labor corps to the trenches in Europe. They did this with the explicit expectation that if the Allies won, the German colonial concessions in China's Shandong province, including the major port city of Qingdao, would be returned to Chinese sovereignty. But at Versailles, the great powers betrayed China. They decided to take those former German territories and award them directly to Japan.
So it's a huge, visceral, anti-imperialist, nationalist protest right on Puyi's doorstep. The students realize the republic is weak and the foreign powers don't respect them.
Exactly. The anger was aimed at the Western powers, at Japan, and at their own corrupt Republican government for failing to protect the nation. And this protest was massive. The sheer volume of the crowds meant that Puyi could actually hear the shouting and notice the unrest from inside the high walls of the Forbidden City.
Because it's right outside.
He was confused. He asked Reginald Johnston what was happening outside, and when Johnston sat him down and explained the geopolitics, the treaty, the betrayal, the concept of Shandong province, and the student outrage, it was an absolute revelation for Puyi.
I'm struggling to understand how a student protest over a treaty in Paris certainly wakes a sheltered ex-emperor up to reality. What is the psychological connection there for him?
Because, as Puyi later reflected in his writings, it marked the very first time in his entire life that he realized the people outside the walls of the Forbidden City had concerns, angers, and political passions that had absolutely nothing to do with him.
Oh, wow.
For his entire life, from the day he was born, he was told he was the divine center of the universe. If people were happy, it was because of him. If they were angry, it was about him.
And suddenly,
The May 4th movement showed him brutally that the universe had completely moved on. The students didn't care about the emperor. They weren't protesting to bring him back or to overthrow him. They cared about national sovereignty, international treaties, and the survival of the Chinese nation-state. It was his first real exposure to modern nationalism, and it made him realize his own utter irrelevance.
it's his theory of mind moment. The sudden, shocking realization that other people have rich, inner lives, political struggles, and massive problems that don't revolve around him in any way. What did Reginald Johnston make of all this? He was observing this boy every single day, watching this awakening happen. What was his official assessment of Puyi's mental and moral state?
Johnston actually wrote a formal, detailed report addressed to the British authorities shortly after his first few months of interviews and lessons with the emperor. His assessment was quite sympathetic, but it was deeply, urgently concerned for the boy's future.
What did he say?
Johnston wrote that physically, Puyi appeared robust and well-developed for his age. Mentally, he described him as a very human, boy lively, highly intelligent, with an enthusiastic sense of humor and surprisingly excellent manners. Totally free from the arrogance one might expect.
Which is honestly miraculous given how he was raised to believe he was a living god.
It is a testament to Puyi's inherent personality. Johnston noted with relief that Puyi hadn't yet been completely spoiled by the nonsense and futility surrounding him in the court. But Johnston was incredibly worried about the toxic environment.
The eunuchs, right, yes.
Yes, he wrote in his report that there was absolutely no hope Puyi would emerge unscathed from the moral dangers of his early adolescence unless he was immediately removed from the influence of what Johnston called the hordes of eunuchs and other useless officials. He viewed the court staff as parasites who were purposefully keeping the boy ignorant to maintain their own power and access to that massive silver subsidy.
Johnston also actively pressured Puyi to cut down on the massive waste and financial extravagance in the palace, right? He wanted him to take control of his own household and be more self-sufficient.
Yes, he encouraged Puyi to audit the palace storehouses, which led to the discovery of massive theft by the eunuchs. But ultimately, Johnston advocated strongly that the best, most humane course of action would be to remove the boy from the harmful, stagnant atmosphere of the Forbidden City entirely.
He wanted him out.
He wanted to move him to the Summer Palace, where Johnston believed Puyi could live a much less artificial, healthier, and happier life, far away from the oppressive rituals and the corrupt officials. He saw the Forbidden City not as a palace, but as a toxic swamp that was slowly drowning a bright young man.
So we have Johnston desperately trying to drag Puyi into the 20th century, trying to give him the tools to survive reality, while the thousands of eunuchs, the traditions, and the physical architecture itself are violently pulling him back into the 19th century. It is a profound, daily tug-of-war for the soul of the last emperor.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
If we pull all these narrative threads together, the paradox of Puyi's life from 1912 to 1924 just defies all logic. Here is a boy who holds the title of emperor, but possesses absolutely no empire. He is handed 160 tons of silver a year to sustain a massive theatrical fantasy world, only to realize he is being used as a high-status pawn by a cynical Republican president who just wants to steal his throne.
And he is trapped in a palace that is occasionally bombed by modern oil-leaking biplanes during chaotic 12-day military coups that he barely comprehends, orchestrated by warlords who are tearing his former empire to pieces.
Right. And how does he cope with this overwhelming, surreal existence? He tries to escape his physical reality by cutting off his hair, sawing the ancient thresholds out of his doorways to ride a bicycle, watching silent American comedies in the throne room, and desperately prank-calling the random citizens of the very republic that overthrew him.
It is surreal.
It is just staggering to think about how bizarre and damaging it would be to grow up being told you are the divine center of the universe, only to slowly, painfully realize that the universe has moved on without you, and you're just a teenager trapped in a very expensive, very lonely museum.
It is, at its core, a profound tragedy of isolation. The massive red walls kept the chaos of the modern world out for a time, but they also systematically prevented him from developing the necessary emotional and political skills to navigate that world once the walls eventually, inevitably, came down.
Which leaves us with a lingering question to ponder as we wrap up part 2 of this massive journey. We have spent a lot of time analyzing Reginald Johnston today. Johnston undoubtedly opened Puyi's eyes. He tried to modernize him, to give him a secular education, and to save him from the toxic influence of the court. But by explicitly teaching this highly impressionable, deposed teenager that monarchies were inherently superior to republics, and giving him a romanticized view of his own potential, did Johnston inadvertently plant the ideological seeds for Puyi's disastrous future?
It is a heavy, consequential question. By giving him a Western education, did Johnston simply hand him modern tools to pursue an ancient, impossible, and ultimately destructive ambition? Did he accidentally build a puppet for the next empire that would come looking for him?
How much of our ultimate destiny is written by the tutors, the mentors, and the voices who shape our worldview when we are at our most isolated and our most vulnerable? Something to chew on. Thank you all for joining us for part 2 of this extraordinary historical deep dive. We will see you next time as we continue to explore the unbelievable life of Puyi.